The blizzard had already swallowed half the valley when the ranch hands heard something moving inside the old hay barn. At first, they thought it was a stray calf, maybe a wolf nosing through the cracks for shelter. But when ranch owner Thomas Whitaker pushed open the frozen door with a lantern in his hand, he found two boys curled beneath a torn horse blanket, their lips blue, their boots split, their small hands wrapped around each other as if brotherhood alone could keep death away. The older boy tried to stand and defend the younger one, but his legs failed before he could speak. One of the ranch hands called them thieves. Another said to send them to town before trouble followed. Then the lantern light caught a small silver necklace hanging from the younger boy's neck, half hidden beneath his ragged shirt. Thomas Whitaker froze so completely that even the horses seemed to stop breathing. He knew that necklace. He had given it to a young woman 20 years earlier, on the last night before she vanished from his life, and if these freezing boys had her necklace, then they were not strangers. They were the answer to a question that had haunted him through every lonely winter since. The winter of 1889 came down hard on Whitaker Ranch, harder than any winter Thomas Whitaker could remember, and he had survived enough of them to know when the land had turned against men. Snow buried the fence lines until only the top rails showed like broken ribs across the valley. Cattle huddled in dark clusters near the windbreaks. The creek froze so thick that ranch hands had to break it open with axes every morning before the sun came over the hills. Even the horses grew quiet, their breath rising in white clouds inside the stables, their ears flicking nervously whenever the wind screamed across the open range. Thomas Whitaker watched it all from the porch of the main ranch house, one gloved hand resting on the post, the other holding a tin cup of coffee gone cold. He was 52 years old, broad-shouldered, gray at the temples, with the face of a man who had spent half his life fighting weather, debt, loneliness, and memory. Whitaker Ranch was one of the largest spreads in the county, but size had never made a home feel full. The house behind him was warm, polished, and well built. The barns were stocked. The cattle were strong. The land was paid for. Yet every winter, when the nights grew long and the wind pressed against the windows, Thomas felt the emptiness of the place more sharply than any cold. He had never married. People in Cedar Hollow had theories about that. Some said he was too proud. Some said he loved money more than family. Some said a man who built a ranch from nothing had no time left for softness. They were wrong. Thomas had loved once. Her name was Clara Bennett, though he had not said it aloud in years. She had been the daughter of a traveling schoolteacher, with dark hair, gentle eyes, and a laugh that made even poor rooms feel rich. 20 years earlier, before Whitaker Ranch became a name men respected, Thomas had been only a struggling cattle hand with a rented horse and a pocket full of promises. He had given Clara a small silver necklace shaped like a wild rose because she once told him roses did not belong only in gardens. Sometimes they grew hardest where the soil was cruel. He had planned to marry her when he returned from a cattle drive. But when he came back, Clara was gone. Her family had vanished from Cedar Hollow overnight. No letter, no explanation, no grave, only rumors. Some said her father owed money. Some said she ran east. Some whispered that powerful men had forced the Bennetts out after a land dispute near the river. Thomas searched for months, then years, but every trail ended in dust. Eventually, he stopped speaking of her because people mistake silence for healing. It was not healing, it was storage. The memory simply waited. That morning, the foreman, Caleb Ross, crossed the yard through knee-deep snow and climbed the porch steps. He was a hard man in his 40s, loyal to the ranch, loyal to Thomas, but not gentle by nature. "North fence is down again," Caleb said. Thomas nodded toward the White Valley. "Send 4 men after breakfast." "Already did." "Then why do you look like bad news found company?" Caleb wiped snow from his mustache. "Because there are tracks near the east barn." Thomas turned. "Wolf?" "Maybe. Small prints, too." "Children?" Caleb's mouth tightened. "Could be drifters. Could be thieves. Storms pushing all kinds toward shelter." Thomas set down his cup. "Where?" "Old hay barn." The old hay barn stood beyond the main stable, near the cottonwoods, used mostly for broken tack, spare boards, and feed that had gone too dry for good stock. No one slept there, unless they had no other choice. Thomas stepped off the porch at once. "Bring a lantern." Caleb frowned. "Best bring a rifle, too." Thomas looked at him. "If it's children, I won't greet them with a gun." The foreman did not argue, though his expression said he wanted to. They crossed the yard with 2 ranch hands following behind. Snow blew sideways now, thick enough to blur the barn into a shadow. As they approached, Thomas saw the tracks Caleb mentioned, small boot prints, uneven and staggered, nearly covered by fresh snow. There were 2 sets, one slightly larger, one very small. Neither looked strong. A strange tightness formed in Thomas's chest. He had seen desperate tracks before. Men left different marks when they were merely trespassing than when they were running from death. He reached the barn door and lifted the latch. It had frozen stiff. Caleb stepped forward and kicked it open. The door groaned inward. Warm animal smell did not greet them, only dry hay, dust, and bitter cold. Thomas raised the lantern. "Who's in here?" At first, nothing moved. Then something shifted behind a stack of old hay bales. One ranch hand raised his rifle halfway. Thomas pushed the barrel down. "I said no guns." He stepped deeper into the barn. "Come out. Nobody will hurt you." A boy's voice answered from the dark, hoarse, and shaking. "We didn't steal nothing." Thomas stopped. Caleb muttered, "That means they thought about it." Thomas ignored him. "Show yourself." Slowly, a boy emerged from behind the hay. He looked about 13, though hunger made it hard to tell. He was thin, dark-haired, with a face too sharp for his age and eyes that had learned suspicion before childhood was done. His coat was patched with pieces of flour sack. His trousers were torn at one knee. His boots were split open at the toes. In one hand he held a broken pitchfork handle like a weapon. Behind him, huddled under a ragged blanket, was a smaller boy of about 8, trembling so violently the hay around him shook. The older boy lifted the stick. "Don't come closer." Caleb Ross scoffed. "Boy, put that down before you embarrass yourself." The older boy's grip tightened. "Touch him, and I'll break your teeth." One of the hands laughed. The sound died when Thomas turned and looked at him. Thomas faced the boy again. "What's your name?" No answer. "I'm Thomas Whitaker. This is my ranch." The boy's jaw tightened. "We'll leave." "Not in this storm. We ain't staying." He tried to step backward, but his legs wavered. The smaller boy coughed, a deep, ugly sound that bent him forward. Thomas heard sickness in it immediately. "Your brother needs a fire." The older boy's eyes flashed. "He needs people to leave us be. People who leave children in barns during blizzards don't get to call it kindness." That struck the boy, though he tried not to show it. Thomas took one slow step closer. "What is your brother's name?" The older boy hesitated. The smaller one whispered, "Eli." The older boy snapped, "Hush!" Thomas softened his voice. "Eli. And you?" The older boy said nothing. Eli looked up through fever-bright eyes. "Jacob." "Eli!" Jacob turned. Anger and fear tangled across his face. Thomas lowered the lantern slightly so the light would not blind them. "Jacob and Eli. Where are your folks?" The silence that followed answered more than words could. Jacob's throat moved. "Gone." Caleb Ross shifted behind Thomas. "Boss, storm or no storm, we can't take in every stray that crawls through a fence." Jacob flinched at the word stray. Thomas saw it and felt anger rise, not loud but old and dangerous. "They are boys, not dogs." Caleb looked away. Eli coughed again and clutched at his shirt. The motion pulled the torn fabric aside. Something silver flashed at his neck. Thomas froze. The lantern trembled in his hand. For a moment the barn vanished. The snow, the ranch hands, the frightened boys, the cold, all of it fell away. He saw Clara Bennett standing beneath a cottonwood 20 years earlier, laughing through tears as he fastened a silver wild rose around her neck. He heard himself promising to come back with enough money to build a house. He heard her say, "Then don't build it too perfect, Thomas. I like a home that can survive muddy boots." The memory struck so hard he nearly forgot to breathe. He stepped closer before he could stop himself. Jacob raised the stick higher. "Stay back." Thomas's voice came out rough. "Where did he get that necklace?" Jacob's eyes narrowed. "It's his." "Where did he get it?" "From our ma." Thomas felt the world tilt. Caleb Ross noticed. "Boss?" Thomas ignored him. His eyes stayed on the silver rose at Eli's throat. It was older now, scratched and dulled, but unmistakable. On the back, if it was truly the same one, there would be tiny initials carved by an awkward young ranch hand using a pocket knife. TW to CB. Your mother, Thomas said carefully. What was her name? Jacob's face hardened instantly. Why? Tell me. No, Thomas swallowed. Was it Clara? The stick in Jacob's hand lowered half an inch. Eli stared at Thomas. How do you know, Mama? The barn went silent. Even the wind seemed to pause against the boards. Thomas closed his eyes briefly, and when he opened them, grief had already changed shape into something more urgent. Because I knew her a long time ago. Jacob took a step in front of Eli. Lots of men knew her name. Not like I did. That's what bad men say. The words hit Thomas with unexpected force. He looked at the boy properly then, not as a freezing child found in his barn, but as someone who had learned to distrust men because men had earned it. You're right to be careful, Thomas said. But your brother will die if we keep talking in the cold. Jacob's lips pressed together. He was shaking now too, though he fought it fiercely. Pride was all he had left to wrap around himself. Thomas removed his heavy coat and held it out. Take this. Jacob did not move. It ain't charity. It is warmth. You can decide what to call it later. Eli whispered, Jacob, I'm cold. That broke him. Not completely, but enough. Jacob dropped the stick and took the coat with stiff hands. Thomas stepped forward and wrapped it around Eli himself. As he did, he saw the necklace clearly, the silver wild rose. The bent petal from the day Clara caught it on a wagon latch. The tiny engraving on the back when Eli shifted. TW to CB. Thomas's vision blurred. Dear God. Caleb Ross came closer. You know it? Thomas nodded once. I gave it to their mother. The ranch hands exchanged looks. Jacob's face turned pale. What do you want? The question was not rude. It was terrified. Thomas wanted to say too many things. I want the 20 years back. I want to know where she went. I want to know if you are hers by blood or mercy. I want to know why 2 boys carrying Clara's necklace nearly froze in my barn while I slept in a warm house built from the years after I lost her. Instead, he said, I want you both inside. Jacob shook his head immediately. No. Yes. We don't go into ranch houses. You do tonight. People ask questions. I have plenty. Then we leave. Jacob tried to lift Eli, but he stumbled. Thomas caught him before he fell. The boy was light. Too light. His anger had hidden how close he was to collapsing. Thomas held him steady. Jacob tried to pull away, but there was no strength left. Listen to me, Thomas said. I don't know what happened to your mother. I don't know why you came here. I don't know who taught you to fear every open door, but I know that necklace, and as long as you wear it, this ranch owes you shelter. Jacob stared at him, confused by the word owes. Thomas turned to Caleb Ross. Get Mrs. Bell from the kitchen. Hot water, blankets, broth. Send a rider for Dr. Harlan if the trail is passable. Caleb hesitated. Boss, if they're running from someone, then we find out who. And if trouble follows? Thomas looked down at Eli's pale face and Jacob's trembling shoulders. Then he looked back at his foreman. Then trouble can freeze outside. Jacob protested until his voice gave out. Eli barely stayed conscious. Mrs. Bell, the ranch cook, took one look at them and began ordering grown men around as if they were poorly trained chickens. Blankets appeared. Fires were stoked. Water was heated. The boys were placed near the kitchen hearth, where warmth rolled over them in waves. Jacob remained half upright, one arm across Eli, as if someone might snatch him away between spoonfuls of broth. Thomas sat across the room, watching the necklace glint against the blanket. He did not crowd them. He remembered Clara's pride. If these were her sons, they would not surrender trust quickly. An hour later, when Eli finally slept, Jacob looked at Thomas through exhausted eyes. Are you going to send us to the county home? No. Sheriff? No. Then what? Thomas leaned forward slowly. I'm going to ask about your mother. Jacob's face closed. She's dead. The words landed like a shovel hitting frozen earth. Thomas had imagined it, feared it, denied it, but hearing it from the boy made the room grow suddenly distant. When? Last spring. Thomas looked toward the fire. For a moment he could not speak. 20 years of searching, wondering, anger, and hope ended in 2 words from a starving child. Last spring. Clara had lived all those years somewhere under the same wide sky, and he had not found her. He had built fences, bought cattle, became respected, grew older, and she had died somewhere beyond his reach. "I'm sorry," he said at last. Jacob watched him closely, searching for falsehood. "She never talked about you." That hurt more than Thomas expected. He nodded. Maybe she had reason. Jacob looked down. "She talked about a ranch sometimes." Thomas went still. "What did she say?" "That there was a place west of Cedar Hollow where the hills turned gold in summer. She said if we ever got lost bad enough, we should find the ranch with the white cottonwoods and ask for shelter." His voice grew quieter. "But she said not to show the necklace unless we had no other choice." Thomas felt the final pieces of the past begin to move, but they did not form a picture yet. "Why?" Jacob's eyes lifted. "Because the men who wanted it already killed once." Before Thomas could ask another question, a sound came from outside. Hoofbeats entering the yard fast, despite the storm. Every man in the kitchen turned. Jacob went rigid. Eli stirred in his sleep. Caleb Ross stepped in from the hall with his hand on his revolver. "Riders," he said. Thomas stood slowly. Through the frosted window, lanterns appeared in the snowy yard. 3 men on horseback. One wore a black coat with a silver badge that did not belong to any law Thomas respected. Jacob's face drained of color. "They found us." Thomas looked at the boys, then at Clara's necklace, then toward the door as a hard fist began pounding against it. The past had not simply returned to his ranch. It had arrived armed. The pounding on the ranch house door came again, harder this time, rattling the hinges and sending a tremor through the kitchen where Jacob and Eli sat wrapped in blankets beside the hearth. Eli's feverish eyes opened halfway, unfocused and afraid, while Jacob moved in front of him so quickly that the blanket slid from his own thin shoulders. Thomas Whitaker saw the boy reach for the broken pitchfork handle he had refused to let go of even after being brought inside. Mrs. Bell, the ranch cook, made a sharp sound under her breath and stepped closer to the stove, as if cast iron and boiling water were weapons she trusted more than prayer. Caleb Ross stood in the hall with his hand on his revolver, his hard face turned toward the front door. Outside, 3 riders waited in the storm, their horses stamping through snow, their lanterns swaying in the wind. The man at the center wore a black coat with a silver badge pinned to it, but Thomas knew enough about badges to know some were bought cheaper than spurs. The fist struck the door a 3rd time. "Open up in the name of county authority," the man shouted. Jacob flinched. Eli whispered, "Reed." Thomas turned slightly. "Who is Reed?" Jacob's jaw tightened. He did not answer. The fist struck again. Caleb Ross looked at Thomas. "Boss?" Thomas's eyes stayed on the boys. "Take them to the back room." Jacob immediately shook his head. "No, no rooms. Jacob, no locked rooms." The terror in that sentence was not childish fear of darkness. It was memory. Thomas felt the warning settle deep in him. "All right. Stay here by the fire." He turned to Mrs. Bell. "Keep them behind you if shooting starts." The cook snorted. "If shooting starts, Mr. Whitaker, I'll put a pan through someone's skull before they reach my kitchen." Under other circumstances, Thomas might have smiled. Tonight, he simply nodded. He crossed the hall with Caleb Ross behind him and opened the front door before the next blow could land. Wind and snow burst into the entryway. The 3 riders stood beneath the porch lantern, coats white with frost. The man in front was lean, sharp-faced, with narrow eyes, and a mustache trimmed too carefully for a man who claimed to ride hard country. His badge read, Deputy Marshal Silas Reed. Thomas had heard the name in Cedar Hollow saloons, usually spoken with distrust after the speaker checked who stood nearby. Behind him sat 2 men, Thomas recognized as hired trackers from the South Range, men who worked for money before law and conscience after neither. Reed smiled as if the storm belonged to him. Thomas Whitaker. Thomas did not step aside. Reed. Cold night. Then say your business quick. Reed's smile widened. I'm tracking 2 runaway minors. Brothers. Older one about 13, younger about 8. Dangerous little thieves, from what I'm told. Thomas's expression did not change. Told by who? Their guardian. Name? Martha Voss. Thomas searched his memory. The name meant nothing, but Jacob's reaction in the kitchen had meant everything. And what makes you think they're here? Reed glanced past him into the warmth of the house. Caleb Ross shifted behind Thomas. Reed noticed and tipped his hat slightly. Foreman. Caleb did not answer. Reed looked back at Thomas. I need to search the property. No. The word was calm, quiet, and final. Reed's smile cooled. You refusing a lawman? I'm refusing a stranger with a shiny badge who rides onto my land at night with hired guns. One of the trackers stiffened. Reed lifted a gloved hand to quiet him. You've always had a proud mouth, Whitaker. Only when someone gives it reason. Reed leaned forward in the saddle. Those boys are wanted. For what? Theft. Destruction of property. Assault. Thomas thought of Jacob lifting a stick with shaking hands, trying to defend a feverish child from grown men. Assault on who? Reed's eyes narrowed. You asking questions because you found them? I ask questions when answers smell rotten. The storm gusted across the porch. For a moment, only the wind spoke. Reed's voice dropped. Their legal guardian wants them returned. Bring papers in daylight. I have authority now. Then you can show it now. Reed's jaw flexed. He reached inside his coat and removed a folded document, holding it up but not handing it over. Signed custody order. Thomas extended his hand. Let me read it. Reed hesitated. Too long. Caleb Ross noticed. Thomas noticed. Even the horses seemed to notice. Finally, Reed passed the paper over. Thomas unfolded it beneath the porch lantern. The document looked official at first glance, but he had signed enough cattle contracts, land agreements, and banknotes to recognize hurried ink and false confidence. The seal was smudged. The date looked altered. The judge's signature at the bottom was not one he knew, though Cedar Hollow had only 2 traveling judges in winter. This says custody of 2 unnamed male minors, Thomas said. Reed shrugged. Didn't have their birth papers. Convenient. Legal. Thomas folded the paper. This also says you are authorized to retrieve them from public roads, lodging houses, or county facilities. It says nothing about searching private ranch property. Reed's face hardened. You always read the small lines? That's how I kept men like you from stealing cattle. The tracker on the left reached toward his rifle. Caleb Ross drew his revolver so fast the motion barely registered. Thomas did not move, but his voice turned cold. Tell your man if his hand touches that rifle, the snow will cover him before morning. Reed stared at Thomas for several long seconds, measuring not only the man but the ranch behind him, the armed foreman at his shoulder, and the lights flickering in bunkhouse windows as ranch hands began to notice trouble at the main house. At last he gave the smallest nod. The tracker lowered his hand. This isn't finished, Reed said. Thomas handed the paper back. It is for tonight. Reed leaned closer. Those boys bring trouble. Thomas looked at the storm beyond the porch, then back at him. So did you. Reed's smile returned, thinner now. Ask the older one what happened at Voss House. Behind Thomas, somewhere in the kitchen, a dish clattered. Jacob had heard. Reed's eyes flicked toward the sound. Thomas stepped into the doorway, blocking the view fully. Leave. For a moment it seemed Reed might test him anyway. Then one of the ranch hands appeared near the bunkhouse with a shotgun. Another stepped from the stable. Another lantern lit near the corral. Whitaker Ranch was waking. Reed gathered his reins. I'll be back with better papers. Thomas's voice remained steady. Then I'll be waiting with better men. Reed turned his horse into the storm. The trackers followed. Their lanterns moved away through the yard, shrinking into blurred gold spots until the snow swallowed them. Thomas stood in the open doorway long after they disappeared. Caleb Ross holstered his revolver. You just invited a fight." "No," Thomas said. "It arrived without invitation." They returned to the kitchen. Jacob stood rigid beside the hearth, pale with fury and fear. Eli clutched the silver wild rose necklace in both hands. "Missus." Belle had one arm protectively in front of them and a skillet in the other. Thomas stopped at the table, giving Jacob distance. "Who is Martha Voss?" Jacob looked away. "Nobody. Reed says she's your guardian." "She ain't. The paper says otherwise." Jacob's eyes snapped back. "Papers lie." Thomas felt something in his chest tighten. A boy that young should not know such a thing so well. "What happened at Voss House?" Jacob's mouth closed hard. Eli began to cry without making sound. Thomas saw it and changed his approach. He pulled out a chair and sat slowly, lowering himself to the boys' level instead of standing above them. "I'm not handing you to Reed tonight. But if he returns with men and papers, I need to know what he is hiding." Jacob stared at him, still deciding whether safety was another kind of trap. Mrs. Bell set the skillet down, came to the boys, and wrapped Eli's blanket tighter. "Child," she said, gentler than Thomas had ever heard her speak, "whatever you broke at that place, I reckon it deserved breaking." Eli looked at Jacob. The older boy's face trembled once before he forced it still. "Voss House isn't a home," he said. "It's where they send children nobody wants." Thomas's jaw tightened. He knew of such places. County homes, charity farms, labor houses with Bible verses painted on walls and hunger in the beds. "How long were you there?" "Since Ma died." "Last spring." Jacob nodded. "A man came after the burial, said Ma owed debts, said we had to work them off." Thomas leaned forward slightly. "What man?" "Mr. Clay Voss, Martha's husband." Caleb Ross muttered a curse. Thomas looked at him. "You know him?" The foreman nodded grimly. "Runs freight contracts south of Fairwater. Mean outfit. Heard he uses orphan labor, but nobody proves it." Jacob gave a bitter little laugh. "Nobody wants proof from children." "No." The room went silent. Thomas felt each word like a nail. "What did they want from you?" Jacob hesitated. Eli answered in a whisper. "Mama's necklace." Jacob closed his eyes. Thomas's gaze moved to the silver wild rose. "Why?" "Don't know," Jacob said. "Ma said never give it up, missus." Voss kept asking where she hid the rest. Thomas went still. "The rest of what?" Jacob shook his head. "I don't know." Eli's voice grew smaller. "She said Mama stole something." Jacob snapped. "She lied." Thomas held up a hand. "I believe you." Jacob looked startled by how quickly he said it. Thomas continued. "Tell me about the night you ran." Jacob swallowed. "They locked Eli in the smokehouse because he wouldn't stop coughing during supper. It was snowing. He had fever. I broke the latch with a shovel. Clay Voss came out. I hit him." His chin lifted in defiance. "I'd do it again." "Good," Mrs. Bell said. Thomas looked at her. She shrugged. "I said what I said." Jacob's eyes shone now, not from weakness, but from holding too much back too long. "We ran 3 days. Slept in a culvert, then under a wagon, then in your barn. Ma told us about the white cottonwoods. I thought maybe—" He stopped. "Maybe what?" Thomas asked softly. Jacob looked toward the fire. "Maybe someone here knew why she kept crying when she thought we were asleep." Thomas lowered his eyes. "Clara." For 20 years he had carried the pain of being left behind. He had rarely considered that perhaps she had carried something worse. Fear. Pursuit. Silence. Children. He touched the edge of the table until the wood grounded him. "Your mother did not steal that necklace." Jacob looked at him. "How do you know?" "Because I gave it to her." Eli's eyes widened. "Why?" Thomas looked at the boy, then at the little silver rose resting against his blanket. "Because I loved her." The words entered the room quietly, but they changed it. Jacob did not soften, not exactly, but his suspicion wavered under the weight of something he had not expected from a ranch owner. Grief. "Were you our father?" he asked bluntly. The question struck Thomas so hard that Caleb Ross looked away. Mrs. Bell went very still. Thomas answered honestly because anything less would dishonor them all. I don't know. Jacob's face hardened again. How can you not know? Because your mother disappeared before I could marry her. I never saw her again. Maybe she didn't want you. Maybe. Thomas accepted the wound because the boy deserved truth more than pride. Or maybe someone made sure she couldn't come back. Eli looked down at the necklace. Mama said roses remember the hand that planted them. Thomas closed his eyes. That sounded exactly like Clara. The storm continued raging outside. Inside, the fire cracked and settled. For the first time, Jacob sat down fully, though he kept one hand on Eli's shoulder. It was not trust yet, but it was exhaustion leaning toward shelter. Thomas stood. You'll sleep here tonight. Jacob opened his mouth. Thomas cut him off gently. Not locked, not hidden. Mrs. Bell will make pallets by the kitchen fire. I'll post men outside. Reed won't enter this house while I breathe. Jacob studied him for a long moment. Why? Thomas looked at the necklace, then at both boys. Because 20 years ago I lost someone I loved. Tonight 2 boys carrying the last piece of her walked into my barn. I don't know what that makes us yet, but I know what it makes this ranch, Eli whispered. What? Thomas's voice softened. Not yours to fear. Jacob looked away quickly, but not before Thomas saw tears gather in his eyes. Later, after broth, medicine, dry socks, and more blankets than either boy seemed to know what to do with, Eli finally slept near the hearth. Jacob remained awake beside him, fighting sleep like it was a guard dog. Thomas sat across the kitchen with a rifle within reach, and Clara's necklace burned into his thoughts. Near midnight, Mrs. Bell placed a folded cloth on the table in front of him. Found this sewn inside the younger one's shirt when I changed him, she whispered. Thomas opened the cloth. Inside was a brittle piece of paper, worn nearly transparent, folded around a tiny brass key. On the paper, in Clara Bennett's handwriting, were 4 words. If Thomas still lives, his hands shook. Beneath those words was a crude drawing of a place he recognized instantly, the old stone spring house beyond the west pasture, abandoned since before the war. Thomas looked toward the sleeping boys, then toward the window where the storm pressed its white face against the glass. Clara had not sent her sons to him only for shelter. She had sent them with a key, and whatever it opened was important enough for men like Reed and Voss to hunt children through a blizzard. Thomas Whitaker did not sleep after finding Clara Bennett's message and the tiny brass key sewn inside Eli's shirt. He sat at the kitchen table until the fire burned low, the brittle paper lying open beneath his hand, while the storm pressed against the windows like a living thing. If Thomas still lives. 4 words, written in Clara's unmistakable hand, had crossed years of silence and arrived inside his house wrapped around a key small enough to disappear in a child's fist. He read them again and again, not because their meaning changed, but because he could not believe the dead could still reach forward so precisely. Across the kitchen, Jacob slept sitting upright with his back against the wall, one arm resting across Eli's blanket. Even exhausted, the older boy guarded his brother. Eli slept fitfully near the hearth, fever flushing his cheeks, the silver wild rose necklace rising and falling against his small chest. Mrs. Bell had finally gone to the pantry room for a few hours of rest after threatening to skin any man who woke the boys without good reason. Caleb Ross stood watch outside with 2 ranch hands, and beyond them, somewhere in the white dark, Silas Reed and the men behind him were likely waiting for daylight and stronger papers. Thomas folded Clara's note carefully and placed it beside the brass key. Then he rose, took his coat from the peg, and reached for his rifle. Jacob's eyes opened at once. Thomas froze. The boy had not been asleep after all. "Where are you going?" Jacob asked. His voice was low, rough from feverish exhaustion and distrust. Thomas looked toward Eli, still sleeping. "West pasture." Jacob pushed himself upright. "Why?" Thomas did not answer quickly enough. Jacob's eyes sharpened. "You found something." Thomas sighed. "Yes." "What?" "A note." Jacob stood too fast and nearly stumbled. "From Ma?" Thomas nodded. The boy crossed the kitchen in 3 steps, anger already rising. "Why didn't you wake me?" "Because you needed sleep." "Don't decide what I need." Thomas accepted the rebuke. "Fair." He handed Jacob the note. The boy took it with both hands. When he saw the handwriting, The anger drained from his face so suddenly that he looked younger, much younger. His lips parted, but no sound came. He traced the words with one dirty thumb. If Thomas still lives. His throat moved. She wrote this. Yes. Where was it? Thomas hesitated. Sewn inside Eli's shirt. Mrs. Bell found it. Jacob's face twisted. She sewed that shirt before she died. Thomas felt the room grow heavier. Did you know about the key? Jacob looked at the small brass object on the table and shook his head. No. Do you know the place drawn underneath? Jacob studied the crude lines. No. It is the old stone spring house, beyond my west pasture. Then I'm going. No. Jacob's head snapped up. Yes. Your brother is sick. Reed may return. You can barely stand. That note was from my mother. And it was addressed to me. The words came out harder than Thomas meant. Jacob flinched, and Thomas regretted them immediately. The boy folded the note carefully and held it against his chest. She was my mother every day, Jacob said. If she trusted you once, fine, but she trusted me at the end. Thomas had no answer for that. None that mattered. He looked at Jacob's thin face, the bruised shadows under his eyes, the stubborn set of his jaw, and saw not a troublesome child but Clara's last witness. All right, he said quietly. Jacob blinked. All right? You come, but you do exactly as I say. I don't take orders. Then think of them as weather warnings. Jacob considered that, then gave one short nod. They left Eli sleeping under Mrs. Bell's care and stepped into a world made almost entirely of wind and snow. The storm had weakened slightly, but the yard still lay buried under drifts. Lantern light glowed from the bunkhouse and stable. Caleb Ross emerged from the porch shadows at once, rifle in hand. Where now? Thomas handed him no explanation. Only the truth he needed. West pasture. Wake Jonah and Miles. Quietly. Caleb's eyes flicked to Jacob. Taking the boy? Yes. Boss? Quietly, Caleb. The foreman studied Thomas's face and stopped arguing. Within minutes, 4 riders moved away from the ranch house. Thomas, Jacob, Caleb Ross, and 2 trusted hands, Jonah Pike and Miles Carver. Jacob rode in front of Thomas because the boy refused to ride behind Caleb, and Thomas refused to let him sit a horse alone in his condition. Jacob hated the arrangement and made that clear by staying rigid as fence wire in the saddle. Thomas said nothing. The ride to the west pasture was slow and punishing. Snow muffled the land until every familiar shape became strange. The white cottonwoods Clara had once remembered stood like ghosts along the creek bed. Beyond them, half hidden beneath a ridge, sat the old stone spring house. It had been built by the first homesteader on the property long before Thomas bought the ranch. The roof sagged. The door leaned crooked. Vines and snow covered most of the stonework. Thomas had not entered it in years. There had never been reason. Now as he dismounted and lifted his lantern, he wondered how many secrets had waited on his land while he rode past them season after season. Jacob slid down beside him and immediately swayed. Thomas reached for him. The boy stepped away. I'm fine. You are not. I said I'm fine, Caleb Ross muttered, stubborn as a mule with a burr under its tail. Jacob glared at him. Better than being an old dog that barks at children. Jonah Pike coughed to hide a laugh. Caleb looked offended. Thomas, despite everything, nearly smiled. The spring house door was frozen shut. Miles broke the ice around the latch with a hatchet. Thomas took out the brass key and found a small lock hidden beneath a rusted iron plate. His pulse quickened. He had lived on this ranch almost 20 years and never known there was a second lock in that door. The key fit. It turned with a soft click that sounded far too delicate for the storm around them. Thomas pulled the door open. Cold, damp air breathed out of the darkness. The lantern revealed stone walls, a broken trough, old barrels, and dust disturbed by no one in years. At first glance, nothing seemed worth killing for. Jacob stepped in first before Thomas could stop him. Careful. You said do what you say, not walk behind you. Jacob, I'm looking. He moved toward the back wall, holding the note. Thomas followed with the lantern. The drawing beneath Clara's words showed a crude square, a line, and something like a star. Jacob searched the stones, then reached toward one near the floor. This one. Thomas crouched. The stone bore a tiny scratched mark, a wild rose, barely visible beneath mineral stains. Clara's mark. He pressed the stone. Nothing. Jacob pushed beside him. Still nothing. Caleb Ross came forward. Move. He struck the stone with the heel of his hand. A dull clunk sounded behind the wall. Thomas and Jacob looked at each other. Together, they pulled. The stone shifted outward, revealing a narrow cavity wrapped in oilcloth. Thomas reached inside and removed a long metal box, black with age, sealed with wax that had cracked but not failed. Jacob stopped breathing. Is it Ma's? Thomas saw the initials pressed into the wax, CB and TW intertwined around a small rose. He closed his eyes briefly. Yes. He opened the box carefully. Inside lay a packet of letters, a folded land deed, a small leather journal, and a second necklace, broken at the clasp. Jacob touched the journal but did not take it. His hand shook. Thomas lifted the top letter. It was addressed to him. Thomas, if you are reading this, then I was right to believe you lived long enough to hear the truth. He had to stop. The words blurred. Jacob's face had gone pale, but his voice was steady. Read it. Thomas looked at him. Here? Read it. The storm moaned outside the spring house. Caleb, Jonah, and Miles stood silent near the door. Thomas unfolded the letter fully and read aloud. Clara wrote that she had not left Cedar Hollow by choice. Her father had discovered forged land papers tied to a cattle syndicate that wanted the Bennett claim near the river. When he refused to sign, men came at night. They beat him, threatened Clara, and forced them onto a wagon before dawn. Thomas had been away on the cattle drive. By the time he returned, the Bennetts were already gone. Clara tried twice to send letters. Both disappeared. Her father died within a year. She later learned that a man named Clay Voss had handled the forged transfer, working with a deputy and a ranch investor who intended to acquire the river claim after the Bennetts vanished. Thomas stopped reading when the name Clay Voss appeared. Caleb Ross cursed softly. Jacob whispered. He said Ma owed him. Thomas forced himself to continue. Clara wrote that she had hidden copies of the original Bennett deed and proof of the false transfer in the spring house because it was the only place she believed Thomas might someday search if her sons reached him. Then came the line that made every man in the room go still. Jacob and Eli are yours in every way that matters, but one of them may also be yours by blood. Thomas's voice broke. Jacob stared at him, confusion and fear colliding across his face. Thomas read the next line silently first, because he did not know whether he had the right to speak it aloud. I was carrying a child when they took me from Cedar Hollow. I never knew if you received my letters, and I never knew if you would forgive me for surviving without you. The spring house seemed to tilt around him. Thomas gripped the paper hard enough to wrinkle it. Jacob stepped back. No. End of loss. Tribe. 2. End of loss. Thomas lowered the letter. Jacob. No. The boy shook his head, anger rising like a shield. Don't say it. Caleb Ross looked away. Jonah removed his hat. Thomas spoke carefully. I won't say anything you aren't ready to hear. Jacob laughed bitterly. Everybody says things, and then pretends children can be ready. He turned toward the door. We should go. Thomas folded the letter, though every part of him wanted to read the rest, to devour the past, to find out whether the boy standing before him was his son. But Jacob was shaking, and not from cold. All right. Jacob stopped, surprised again. Thomas placed the letter back into the box and closed it. We go. You're not going to read the rest? Not without you. Jacob's mouth trembled, but he pressed it flat. Maybe I don't want to know. Thomas nodded. Then tonight we only know enough to stay alive. Caleb Ross stepped toward the door, but suddenly lifted a hand. Everyone froze. Outside, through the wind, came the faint jingle of harness metal. Horses. More than one. Thomas blew out the lantern instantly. Darkness swallowed the spring house. Jacob stood rigid beside him. Caleb moved silently to the cracked doorway and looked out. Snow shifted beyond the cottonwoods. Lanterns appeared through the trees. Silas Reed's voice carried faintly over the wind. They came this way. Spread out. Voss wants the box, and the boys before Whitaker understands either. Jacob's breath caught. Thomas tucked Clara's metal box beneath his coat and drew his revolver. Caleb Ross lifted his rifle. In the darkness, Thomas felt Jacob's hand suddenly grip his sleeve. Not trust fully, not yet, but fear choosing the nearest shelter. Thomas covered the boy's hand with his own for one brief second. Outside, Reed's men moved closer to the spring house, unaware that the truth they hunted had just been opened and that Thomas Whitaker had finally learned enough of the past to be dangerous. Thomas Whitaker held Jacob's hand against his sleeve for only a heartbeat before the boy pulled away, embarrassed by the fear that had betrayed him. Outside the stone spring house, lanterns drifted through the white cottonwoods like yellow eyes. Silas Reed's men moved with practiced caution, spreading across the west pasture while the storm softened their boot steps but not their voices. Thomas could hear Reed clearly now, close enough that every word found its way through the warped door and stone cracks. "Check the spring house first," Reed ordered. "Voss said the woman hid it somewhere on this land, and Whitaker's too sentimental not to come looking once he saw the necklace." Jacob's breath sharpened in the dark. Thomas crouched beside him and leaned close. Not a sound. Jacob glared, as if silence had been his idea first, but he obeyed. Caleb Ross stood beside the door with his rifle raised. Jonah Pike and Miles Carver positioned themselves near the back wall, though there was no rear exit that Thomas knew of. The metal box containing Clara's letters and deed copies lay under Thomas's coat, heavy against his ribs. It suddenly felt less like paper and more like a beating heart. Outside, boots crunched closer. A shadow crossed the gap beneath the door. Caleb Ross mouthed a curse. Thomas looked around the spring house, searching for any advantage. Stone walls, broken trough, old barrels. No window wide enough for a man. No trapdoor, no second door. But Clara had hidden a box here. Clara had marked a stone. Clara had trusted this place. Perhaps she had trusted more than one secret. Thomas glanced at the wall where the hidden cavity had been opened. The removed stone sat near Jacob's boot. Behind it, the dark hole went deeper than he had first realized. He reached inside again, feeling past damp grit and old cobwebs. His fingers brushed iron. A ring. He pulled. Nothing moved. He pulled harder. A section of the stone floor near the trough shifted less than an inch. Jacob saw it and dropped beside him. Together, they hooked their hands under the edge and lifted. A narrow opening appeared beneath the floor, black and cold, releasing the smell of earth and underground water. Caleb Ross stared. "Well, I'll be damned," Thomas whispered. "Later." The boots outside stopped at the door. Reed's voice came from the other side. "Whitaker? You in there?" No answer. Thomas motioned toward the opening. Jonah went first, lowering himself into darkness. Then Miles. Caleb pointed at Jacob. "Boy." Jacob shook his head. "Thomas first." Thomas nearly corrected him for using his name so plainly, then realized there was no time and no point. He handed Clara's box to Jacob. "You keep this between your coat and your chest. If we get separated, you run for the ranch." Jacob's eyes widened. "Separated? That is what 'if' means." Reed struck the door with something heavy. "Open it." Caleb Ross fired one shot through the doorframe, not to hit but to warn. Men outside shouted and scattered. Thomas grabbed Jacob and shoved him toward the opening. The boy climbed down, clutching the metal box. Thomas followed. Caleb came last just as bullets punched through the springhouse door, spraying splinters into the dark. He dropped through the opening and pulled the stone slab down over them as the door above burst inward. Darkness swallowed them completely. For several seconds there was no sound except breathing and the muffled thud of boots overhead. Then Jonah whispered from below, "Tunnel." Thomas struck a match. The weak flame revealed a narrow passage lined with rough stone, just high enough for a crouched man. Water trickled along one side. Roots hung through cracks like old fingers. The tunnel sloped westward beneath the pasture. Jacob stared around him. Did Ma know about this? Thomas shielded the match from dripping water. "She must have." Caleb Ross grunted. "Question is where it comes out." Above them, Reed shouted in fury. Find the floor. They're under it. The group moved. Jonah led with a lantern he had managed to keep dry beneath his coat. The tunnel forced them single file. Jacob followed close behind Thomas, still holding Clara's box. Caleb Ross came last, rifle ready despite the cramped walls. The passage seemed older than the ranch itself, perhaps built by the first homesteader to access spring water during raids or storms. After 50 yards, it split. One side sloped upward. The other continued down toward the sound of water. Thomas hesitated. Jacob pointed to the upward passage. Air. Thomas looked at him. How do you know? I feel it, Caleb muttered. Boys got fox senses. Jacob said, better than old dog ears. Even in the tunnel, Jonah almost laughed. Thomas chose the upward passage. Behind them, distant shouting echoed through the stone. Reed had found the opening. The chase became a crawl through cold darkness. Jacob's breathing grew rougher with each step, but he refused help. Twice Thomas slowed, and twice Jacob hissed, keep moving. At last, the tunnel ended beneath a rotted wooden hatch half buried in snow. Jonah pushed it open cautiously. They emerged behind a cluster of rocks near the dry creek bed nearly a quarter-mile from the spring house. The ranch house lights glowed faintly across the valley. Between them and safety lay open snow. Behind them, Reed's men were still at the spring house, but not for long. Thomas turned to Caleb. Take Jacob and the box to the house. Jacob immediately objected. No. Thomas ignored him. Jonah Miles with them. Caleb frowned. And you? I'll draw Reed east. Boss, that's foolish. That's why it might work. Jacob stepped forward, still clutching the box. Thomas looked down at him. Your brother is at the house. That stopped the boy. Thomas softened his voice. Eli needs you more than I do. Jacob looked across the snow toward the distant kitchen light. The fight in him wavered. You'll come back? Thomas did not promise lightly. I'll try. Jacob's jaw tightened. That's not good enough. It is the truth. The boy studied him, then shoved Clara's box into Thomas's hands. Then you carry it. Thomas blinked. Jacob, if they catch me with it, Eli loses both of us. If they catch you, you can fight better. Thomas understood the brutal logic and hated that a child had formed it so quickly. He tucked the box back under his coat. Go. Caleb Ross grabbed Jacob by the shoulder, gentler than usual, but firm. Come on, fox boy. Jacob resisted only 1 second before running with them toward the ranch house, low through the snow. Thomas watched until they vanished into drifting white. Then he turned east and fired 2 shots into the air. Reed's distant voice rose immediately. There, creek bed. Thomas ran. He had not run like that in years, not since he was a young cattle hand trying to impress Clara by racing storms across open pasture. Snow dragged at his boots. Cold tore his lungs. Behind him, riders shouted and changed direction. Lanterns bobbed through the trees. A bullet snapped past his shoulder and disappeared into the dark. Thomas cut toward the cattle ravine, where the land dipped sharply between 2 ridges. If Reed followed mounted, the horses would struggle. If Reed dismounted, Thomas might make the old line shack before they reached him. He was halfway to the ravine when a rider burst from the snow to his right. One of Reed's trackers. Thomas swung his rifle up, but the man crashed into him before he could fire. They hit the snow hard. Clara's box nearly slipped from his coat. The tracker drove an elbow into Thomas's ribs. Thomas answered with a fist to the man's jaw, rolled, and slammed the rifle stock into his shoulder. The tracker groaned and fell sideways. Thomas staggered up, grabbed his rifle, and kept running. More hoofbeats came behind him now. Reed was close. At the ranch house, Jacob stumbled through the kitchen door with Caleb Ross and the others. Eli woke instantly. Jacob! The older boy rushed to him and dropped beside the hearth. Mrs. Bell looked from his snowy clothes to his empty hands. Where is Mr. Whitaker? Jacob could not answer. Caleb did, drawing them off. Mrs. Bell's face hardened. Men. She said it like a diagnosis. Jacob looked toward the window, panic building. He has the box. Good, Caleb said. That means Reed follows him, not you. You let him go alone? Caleb stiffened. I don't let Thomas Whitaker do anything. Jacob stood, anger returning because it was easier than fear. Then I'm going after him. Mrs. Bell caught him by the collar with surprising speed. You take one step toward that door, and I will tie you to the stove with apron strings. You can't. Child, I have trussed turkeys bigger than you. Eli reached for Jacob's sleeve. Don't go. Jacob froze. Eli's face was pale again, the fever not broken. Jacob sank beside him, torn in half. Outside, the bunkhouse men gathered with rifles as Caleb Ross organized the defense. Barricade the front. 2 men in the loft. No one shoots unless they cross the porch. Reed may have papers, but he doesn't have a right to storm a house. Mrs. Bell looked toward Jacob. And what did you find out there? Jacob hesitated. He glanced at Eli, then at the silver necklace. Mama hid a box. Eli touched the necklace. For Thomas? For us too. What was in it? Jacob looked toward the window where the storm hid everything. Trouble. Meanwhile, Thomas reached the cattle ravine with Reed and 2 men closing from behind. He slid down the icy bank, nearly losing his footing, and crossed the frozen stream at the bottom. A rifle cracked. Pain burned across his upper arm. He stumbled but did not fall. Warm blood spread beneath his coat. Whitaker! Reed shouted from the ridge above. Give me the box and the boys stay alive. Thomas crouched behind a boulder, breathing hard. Funny, he called back. Men who promise not to kill children usually weren't planning kindness. Reed laughed. You think Clara's letters matter? You think a dead woman's scribbling can fight signed deeds? Thomas pulled the metal box from beneath his coat and held it close. You sound nervous, Reed. I sound practical. There are men above you, men above Voss, men above this county. That riverland is worth more than your whole ranch. Thomas went still. Riverland. Clara's father's claim. The forged transfer. The piece he had not yet understood. Reed continued, confident now that he had Thomas pinned. You should have let the boys freeze. Would have saved everyone. Grief. Something cold and calm settled over Thomas. Not rage. Rage burned too fast. This was deeper, steadier. Come down and say that closer. Reed did not. Instead, he sent one tracker down the bank. Thomas waited until the man reached the stream, then fired into the ice at his feet. The ice shattered. The tracker plunged knee-deep into freezing water with a scream. Reed cursed. Thomas used the moment to run along the ravine toward the old line shack. Another shot struck the rocks behind him. His wounded arm throbbed. The box felt heavier with each step. He reached the shack just as his legs nearly failed. The door hung loose. It too. Inside were broken tools, old rope, and a rusted stove. Thomas barred the door with a plank and leaned against the wall, breathing through pain. Through a crack, he saw Reed and the remaining tracker approaching cautiously. No horse could climb the ravine slope here. No ranch hands were close enough to help. Thomas had minutes at most. He opened Clara's box, pulled out the letters and deed copies, and searched desperately by lantern stublight. The deed showed the Bennett River claim bordered Whitaker Ranch's west pasture and included water rights to the only reliable spring-fed creek in the valley. Whoever controlled it could control cattle movement, irrigation, and future rail access across 3 ranches. No wonder Voss wanted it. No wonder Clara had been hunted. Then Thomas found a final page folded beneath the journal. It was not addressed to him. It was addressed to Jacob. His heart tightened. He had no right. He also had no time. He opened it. My brave Jacob, if you are reading this, then I failed to keep the wolves from your door, but I did not fail to love you. Thomas swallowed hard and skipped down the page, searching for names, instructions, anything that might save the boys. Near the bottom, he found the line that changed everything. Eli wears the rose, but you carry the truth in your name. Jacob Thomas Bennett. The room blurred. Outside, Reed reached the shack. Last chance, Whitaker. Thomas folded the letter with shaking hands. Jacob Thomas Bennett. Clara had named the boy after him. Whether by blood or by promise, she had given Thomas a son in the only way she could while running from men who stole lives with ink and guns. Reed kicked the door. The plank cracked. Thomas tucked the letters inside his shirt and gripped his rifle with his good arm. The door shuddered again. This time the plank split. Thomas lifted the rifle. If the past wanted to take Clara's sons from him now, it would have to step through smoke first. The first blast tore through the door of the old line shack and filled the room with smoke, splinters, and the sharp stink of gunpowder. Thomas Whitaker fired from behind the overturned stove with his wounded arm burning like a brand and Clara's letters pressed against his chest beneath his shirt. The shot slammed into the doorframe inches from Silas Reed's head, forcing the deputy marshal back into the snow with a curse. Thomas had aimed wide on purpose. Not because Reed deserved mercy, but because dead men answered fewer questions, and Thomas needed answers almost as badly as he needed air. Outside, the storm moved through the cattle ravine in long white sheets. Reed shouted to the remaining tracker, "Circle left! Smoke him out!" Thomas heard boots crunching through snow toward the shack's side wall. He shifted, gritting his teeth as pain ran from shoulder to wrist. The bullet had cut deep through his upper arm. Blood soaked the sleeve beneath his coat, warm at first, now cooling fast. The metal box lay under the broken table near his boots, empty except for the second necklace, and the deed copies he had not stuffed into his shirt. If Reed got inside, everything Clara had saved could vanish. Thomas fired again through a crack in the wall. The tracker ducked away. Reed laughed from the ravine. "You can't hold a shack forever, Whitaker. Never planned to live here. Give me the papers. Come take them. Voss will pay better than pride." Thomas looked down at the letter addressed to Jacob, now folded inside his shirt with the others. Jacob Thomas Bennett. The name had struck deeper than the bullet. Clara had named the older boy after him, but the letter did not clearly say whether Jacob was his blood or his promise. Thomas found that, in the moment, it did not matter as much as he once imagined it would. The boy had stood in his kitchen with hollow cheeks and fierce eyes, protecting Eli with a courage most grown men borrowed and quickly returned. Blood might explain the past. It did not decide the future. Outside, the tracker reached the side wall and shoved a rifle barrel through a gap between boards. Thomas dropped flat just as the shot shattered a shelf above him. Old nails rained across his coat. He grabbed the broken stove poker with his good hand and jammed it through the same gap. The tracker yelped and fell back. Thomas rose, stumbled to the door, and kicked it outward with all the strength left in him. Reed had not expected him to charge. That surprise bought Thomas 3 seconds. He burst into the snow, shoulder first, slamming into Reed before the man could raise his pistol. They crashed down the bank together. The world became white, black, pain, and rage. Reed struck Thomas across the wounded arm. Thomas nearly blacked out. Reed rolled on top, teeth bared. "You old fool! You should have let the past stay buried." Thomas drove his forehead into Reed's nose. Reed fell sideways, blood pouring over his mustache. Thomas grabbed for his rifle, but the tracker kicked it away. Reed staggered up, pistol in hand, face twisted with fury. Enough. A gunshot cracked from the ridge above. The tracker spun and collapsed into the snow, clutching his leg. Reed froze. Thomas turned his head. Caleb Ross stood at the top of the ravine with a rifle smoking in his hands. Beside him were Jonah Pike, Miles Carver, and 3 more ranch hands from the bunkhouse. Caleb's voice carried down through the storm. "Step away from him, Reed." Reed lifted his free hand slowly but kept the pistol angled near Thomas. "This is lawful recovery." Caleb descended the slope, eyes hard. "Funny. Law looks a lot like attempted murder from up here. Whitaker is harboring runaways." Thomas forced himself onto one elbow. "Those boys are under my protection," Reed snarled. "You have no claim. Maybe not yet." Thomas stood unsteadily, blood running down his sleeve. "But I have Clara Bennett's original deed, her letters, and proof Voss forged his way into land that never belonged to him." Reed's eyes flickered. Caleb saw it. So did every ranch hand. The deputy marshal's confidence wavered, and with it the mask of law slipped just enough to show greed beneath. Reed tried one final bluff. "Those papers won't stand." Thomas took a step toward him. "Then why did you chase children through a blizzard for them?" Reed's jaw clenched. Caleb Ross moved in and took the pistol from his hand. "That's enough law for one night." Reed lunged suddenly, not toward Caleb, but toward Thomas's coat where he believed the letters were hidden. Thomas, weakened but ready, caught him with a hard punch that reopened the cut in his own arm and sent Reed to his knees. Caleb clubbed Reed's wrist with the rifle stock and forced him face down into the snow. "Tie him," Caleb ordered. The ranch hands moved quickly. The wounded tracker groaned nearby. Thomas leaned against the shack wall and tried to breathe. Caleb looked at his bloody sleeve and cursed. You planning to bleed your way back to the house? Thomas gave him a tired look. If no better transport is offered. Stubborn fool. Old dog. Caleb blinked. Did that boy teach you that? Despite the pain, Thomas almost smiled. Then the smile faded. The boys? Safe. House is locked down. Eli's fever's worse, though. Mrs. Bell says Dr. Harlan better arrive before dawn, or she'll go drag him out of bed herself. Thomas pushed away from the wall immediately. The world tilted. Caleb caught him. Easy. We go back. We will, after I wrap that arm. Now. Caleb looked like he wanted to argue, but he saw Thomas's face and decided not to waste breath. They gathered the metal box, the deed copies, the broken necklace, and Reed's false custody paper. Reed was tied across a saddle, furious and silent. The tracker with the leg wound was bound and carried by 2 men. The other had fled into the storm, leaving a trail Caleb sent Jonah to follow until daylight. The return to the ranch seemed twice as long as the ride out. Thomas swayed in the saddle, holding consciousness by force. Clara's letters pressed against his heart. Jacob's name burned in his mind. When the ranch house finally appeared through the snow, every window was lit. Men stood at the porch with rifles. Mrs. Bell opened the door before the horses reached it, and her face went white at the sight of Thomas's blood. "Get him inside," she snapped. "And if he says he's fine, hit him." Thomas opened his mouth. Caleb said, "Don't." Inside, warmth hit like a wave. Jacob stood near the hearth, pale and rigid. Eli lay bundled on a pallet, breathing fast, cheeks flushed with fever. The moment Jacob saw Thomas's bloody sleeve, his face changed, not into softness, into fear disguised as anger. "You got shot." Thomas allowed Caleb to guide him into a chair. "A little." "That ain't a little." "No." "Mrs." Bell cut the sleeve away with scissors, scolding every man in the room while she worked. Grown men with rifles and not a teaspoon of sense among them. Caleb Ross stood near the doorway, keeping an eye on Reed, who had been dragged inside and tied to a chair by the mudroom under guard. Jacob hovered near the table, torn between Eli and Thomas. Thomas saw the boy's eyes flick toward his coat. "The box is safe," he said. Jacob's jaw tightened. "I didn't ask." "Your face did." "Mrs." Bell poured whiskey over the wound. Thomas sucked in a breath. Jacob stepped closer despite himself. "Does it hurt?" "Yes." That honest answer seemed to matter to the boy. He nodded once, as if filing away the fact that Thomas did not lie about pain. Dr. Harlan arrived an hour before dawn, half frozen and deeply annoyed, having been fetched by 2 ranch hands who refused to take no for an answer. He examined Eli first, because Thomas insisted, and because Mrs. Bell threatened the doctor with permanent banishment from her biscuits if he did otherwise. Eli had lung fever, serious but not beyond hope, if kept warm and watched carefully. Jacob stood beside the pallet during the examination, fists clenched, eyes tracking every movement. When Dr. Harlan gave Eli a bitter medicine and said the fever might break by evening, Jacob finally exhaled. Only then did the doctor turn to Thomas. "You're next." Thomas waved him off. "It's a graze." The doctor looked at the blood-soaked towels. "If that is a graze, I am the Queen of England," Mrs. Bell said. "Your Majesty, stitch him." The kitchen became a strange kind of battlefield after that. Eli fighting fever by the hearth. Thomas being stitched at the table. Reed tied and guarded in the mudroom, ranch hands moving in and out with reports from the yard, and Jacob sitting between his brother and the ranch owner as if uncertain which one might disappear first. At sunrise, the storm finally began to weaken. The world outside turned pale blue. Reed, silent for hours, suddenly spoke from the mudroom. "You think Voss stops because I'm tied?" Thomas turned his head. Reed smiled through a swollen nose. "He'll come with real warrants, real men, maybe county officials, maybe a judge. That deed won't save them." Jacob stood. "Shut up." Reed's eyes slid to him. "There he is," Clara's little guard dog. Thomas rose so sharply the doctor cursed and grabbed for the needle still in his hand. Caleb Ross stepped toward Reed, but Jacob moved first. He walked into the mudroom, small, thin, exhausted, yet burning with a fury that made every adult pause. "My ma was better than every man who chased her," Jacob said. Reed sneered. "Your ma caused all this by keeping what wasn't hers." Jacob lifted his chin. "Then why are you tied to a chair and she's still scaring you from the grave?" "Mrs." Belle whispered. "Oh, I like him." Reed's sneer faded. Thomas watched Jacob with something fierce and aching in his chest. The boy did not need anyone to speak for him, but he did need someone to stand behind him. Thomas stepped into the mudroom. "Reed, before this day ends, you will tell me where Voss is, who signed those false papers, and why Clara's land is worth enough to hunt her sons." Reed laughed. "Or what?" Thomas leaned down until they were eye to eye. "Or I send for every rancher whose water rights touch that river claim, every widow cheated by Voss freight contracts, every church mother who ever lost a child to that so-called guardian house, and Sheriff Bell from Cedar Hollow. Then I let them ask questions in whatever order they prefer." Reed's face changed slightly. There it was. Fear, not of Thomas alone, but of witnesses. Clay Voss, and men like him, survived by dividing people into small, frightened pieces. Thomas suddenly understood the next move. They needed the town. Not just guns. Not just letters. A public reckoning. He turned to Caleb Ross. "Send riders to Cedar Hollow. Sheriff Bell, Reverend Miles, Judge Albright if he's in county, and every ranch owner along the river." Caleb nodded. "Message?" Thomas looked at Clara's necklace around Eli's throat, the metal box on the table, Jacob standing straight despite exhaustion, and Reed tied beneath his roof. "Tell them Clara Bennett's sons have come home with proof." Reed's head snapped up. "You fool." Thomas did not look at him. "And tell them Clay Voss is invited to deny it in daylight." By mid-morning, riders left Whitaker Ranch in 4 directions. The storm broke fully an hour later, revealing a valley buried in white and glittering beneath a hard winter sun. Thomas stood on the porch with his arm bandaged and his coat over his shoulders, watching hoofprints cut across the snow toward town. Jacob stepped beside him quietly. For a while, neither spoke. Then the boy said, "You read more of the letter." Thomas closed his eyes briefly. "Yes." "The part for me?" "Some." Jacob stared out at the valley. "What did it say?" Thomas reached inside his coat and removed the folded page. "It is yours." Jacob did not take it. "Tell me one thing first." Thomas waited. The boy's voice came very quietly. "Did she say who my father was?" The question Thomas had feared stood between them in the cold sunlight. He could have answered too much, too fast. He could have told the boy about his name, about the possibility, about the years stolen from all of them. Instead, he chose the truth that would not crush him. "She said you carried my name." Jacob looked down sharply. "What name?" "Thomas." The boy's face tightened. "Jacob Thomas Bennett." Thomas nodded. Jacob's eyes shone, but he did not cry. "That doesn't prove anything." "No. Names can be just names." "Yes." Jacob looked up at him. "Do you want it to prove something?" Thomas looked across the white pasture where Clara had once hidden a box for a future she did not know would come. "I used to think blood was the answer I needed most. And now?" Thomas turned to him. "Now I think you and Eli freezing in my barn was answer enough." Jacob looked away quickly, but not before Thomas saw the wall inside him crack. Far down the road, 3 riders appeared, moving fast toward the ranch. For one hopeful second, Thomas thought they were the first messengers returning. Then Caleb Ross shouted from the corral, "Riders from the south!" Reed laughed from inside the house. Too late. Thomas's hand went to his revolver. Jacob stepped back toward the door, fear returning. Across the snowy valley, more riders crested the southern ridge. Not 3, 10, 15. At their center rode a broad man in a fur-lined coat on a black horse, with a red scarf at his throat and arrogance in every line of his body. Clay Voss had not waited for an invitation to deny the truth in daylight. He had come to take the boys before daylight could reach him. Clay Voss rode into Whitaker Ranch like a man arriving to collect property already paid for. He came at the center of 15 riders, broad in the saddle, wrapped in a fur-lined coat, red scarf bright against the snow, with a face that looked carved from appetite rather than bone. Behind him were hired men with rifles, 2 county clerks who looked as if they regretted every choice that led them there, and a narrow-faced lawyer carrying a leather case under one arm. The storm had broken, but the air remained sharp enough to sting. Sunlight glittered across the valley and made the approaching riders look almost grand from a distance, but Thomas Whitaker saw nothing grand in them. He saw wolves learning to walk upright. Jacob stood on the porch beside him, one hand gripping the doorframe, the other hidden beneath his coat where Clara's note rested against his chest. Eli lay inside near the fire, too weak to stand, the silver rose necklace still around his throat. Mrs. Bell stood behind the kitchen window with a rifle she handled badly but sincerely. Caleb Ross and every ranch hand Thomas trusted had spread across the yard, posted at the stable, bunkhouse, corral, and porch. Silas Reed remained tied in the mudroom under guard, swollen and furious. Thomas's wounded arm throbbed beneath the bandage, but he kept his coat over it so Voss would not see weakness before hearing truth. Clay Voss reined in before the porch and smiled. "Thomas Whitaker, you always did know how to make a private matter theatrical." Thomas did not move from the top step. "You brought 15 riders to collect 2 sick boys. Seems you know theater well enough." Voss glanced toward Jacob. His smile sharpened. "Jacob Bennett, you have caused considerable trouble." Jacob stiffened but did not step back. Thomas noticed and felt pride cut through worry. "His name is Jacob Thomas Bennett," Thomas said. Voss's eyes flickered, quick as a snake's tongue. "Is that what the dead woman wrote?" Thomas's hand tightened at his side. "Careful how you speak of Clara." Voss leaned forward. "Careful is what kept you ignorant for 20 years. The words landed in the yard like a slap. Several ranch hands shifted. Caleb Ross's rifle lifted half an inch. Thomas raised his good hand slightly, stopping him. "Say what you came to say." Voss nodded to the lawyer. The narrow man dismounted and opened his case, removing documents tied with red ribbon. "By order of county guardianship and debt recovery, Jacob Bennett and Eli Bennett are to be remanded to the custody of Clay and Martha Voss, lawful guardians appointed after the death of Clara Bennett. Additionally, any personal property carried by said minors is subject to inventory and claim review due to outstanding debts owed by the deceased." Mrs. Bell shouted from inside. "Debt's my foot." The lawyer flinched. Voss ignored her. Thomas descended one step. "Your deputy already showed a paper last night. It was thin enough to see the lies through." Voss smiled. "Deputy Reed was hasty. These are cleaner. Clean paper can still carry filth." The 2 county clerks looked down. Voss noticed and frowned. "Whitaker, you have no legal standing." Thomas felt Jacob glance at him. That was the heart of it. No legal standing. A phrase men used when they hoped a decent man would obey forms while evil men broke souls. Thomas looked toward the road beyond Voss's riders. His own messengers had not returned yet. Cedar Hollow was still too far. Sheriff Bell, Judge Albright, the river ranchers, Reverend Miles, none had arrived. Voss had timed his move well. Thomas had guns, but guns alone could turn the boys into fugitives again, and Clara's proof into contested evidence carried by a wounded man. He needed time. "You want property inventoried?" Thomas asked. Voss's smile returned. "So you'll cooperate." "I said you want it. I did not say you get it." "Then what are you offering?" Thomas looked at the lawyer. "Read your claim before witnesses." The lawyer hesitated. Voss frowned. "What?" "You came with papers. Read them in the yard. Let every man here hear exactly what you claim Clara Bennett owed, why her sons belong to your house, and why a necklace given to her before either boy was born matters to you." Voss's eyes cooled. "I don't perform for cowhands." Caleb Ross called from the stable. "Good. We hate bad acting." A few hands laughed darkly. Voss's jaw tightened. Thomas pressed. "If your papers are lawful, daylight won't hurt them." The county clerks shifted uncomfortably again. The lawyer adjusted his collar. Voss studied Thomas, then Jacob, then the armed men around the yard. He understood the game. Thomas was trying to make secrecy public. He also understood that refusing would look like fear. "Fine," Voss said. "Read it." The lawyer stepped forward, voice thin but steady at first. He read that Clara Bennett had accepted food, lodging, medical supplies, and burial expenses from Voss House after her illness. He read that she had pledged labor from her sons to repay debt. He read that she possessed items believed to have been unlawfully removed from Voss-controlled property. He read that Jacob and Eli were wards bound until debt satisfaction. With each line, Jacob's face grew paler. Thomas listened without interruption until the lawyer finished. Then he said, "Now read the amounts." The lawyer blinked. "I beg pardon?" "The debts." "Read them." Voss's expression darkened. "Irrelevant." Thomas looked at the clerks. "Is it?" One clerk swallowed. "Debt claims usually require itemized amounts." The lawyer reluctantly flipped pages. Food and board, 8 months, $160. Medical attending, $40. Burial, $22. Damages to smokehouse latch, $6. Lost labor value calculated at... "Stop there," Thomas said. "Lost labor value?" Voss folded his gloved hands over his saddle horn. They were old enough to work. Jacob spoke before Thomas could. "Eli is 8. Voss looked at him as if at a barking dog. "And still 8. Thomas stepped off the porch into the snow. The yard went still. "You locked a fevered 8-year-old in a smokehouse." Voss shrugged. "Discipline. That is not discipline." "No? What would a lonely ranch owner know about raising children?" Thomas felt the insult cut, but he let it pass. Jacob did not. "More than you." Voss's eyes shifted to the boy. "Careful." Jacob moved down one step despite Thomas's silent warning. "You made us sleep in the washroom when the older boys were sick. You fed us burned scraps and said hunger made children obedient. You hit Tommy Laird with a harness buckle until he couldn't stand. You sold Millie Grant to a freight family and told everyone she ran away." The yard fell silent. One of the county clerks looked up sharply. The lawyer's face changed. Voss's smile vanished. "That is enough." Jacob's voice shook now, but he continued because stopping would be worse. "You ask Mama about the necklace every week. Mrs. Voss searched Eli's shirt while he slept. You said if Mama hid the river papers, we would work until our backs bent like hers." Voss snapped. "Liar." Eli's voice came weakly from the doorway. Everyone turned. Somehow he had dragged himself from the pallet and stood wrapped in a blanket. "Mrs.?" Belle behind him, looking horrified and ready to carry him bodily back inside. The silver rose necklace glinted at his throat. "He ain't lying," Eli whispered. Jacob rushed up the porch. "Eli, go back." Eli shook his head, trembling. "You always talk for me." Jacob stopped, stricken. Eli looked toward Voss with fever-bright eyes. "You put me in the smokehouse because I coughed." Jacob broke the latch. "Mama said if bad men came, show the rose to Thomas." The younger boy turned to Thomas. "Are you Thomas?" Thomas's throat tightened. "Yes." Eli's face crumpled with relief, so pure it nearly broke everyone watching. "Then Mama found you." Thomas could not speak. Voss recovered faster than anyone else. "Enough sentiment. The child is fevered and confused. Bring them down." 2 riders dismounted. Caleb Ross cocked his rifle. So did 5 ranch hands. Voss's men raised theirs. The yard became a powder keg. Thomas lifted his hand, but the tension had already gone too far. One frightened county clerk stumbled backward. The lawyer dropped a document. Jacob pulled Eli behind him. Thomas stepped between the boys and the guns. "No one moves." Voss smiled without warmth. "You won't start a range war over 2 debt orphans." "No," Thomas said. "You will." A rifle cracked from the bunkhouse roof. Not a shot fired at anyone, but into the snow between Voss's horse and the porch. Everyone froze. Mrs. Bell's voice rang out from the upstairs window. "Next one goes lower." Caleb Ross shouted. "Ma'am, was that you?" "Don't sound so surprised." For one absurd second, the yard hung between terror and laughter. Then hoofbeats sounded from the north road. Heads turned. Riders approached fast. A half-dozen at first, then more behind them. Thomas's heart lifted. Sheriff Bell rode at the front, coat flapping, badge visible, with Reverend Miles beside him and Judge Albright in a dark traveling cloak. Behind them came 3 ranch owners from the river line, 2 women Thomas recognized from the church charity board, and more townspeople than seemed practical in such weather. Clay Voss's face tightened. The public reckoning had arrived sooner than he hoped. Sheriff Bell reined in and took in the scene. Armed men, boys on the porch, Voss in the yard, Reed tied visible through the open mudroom door, Thomas bleeding through his bandage. "Mr. Whitaker," the sheriff said, "your message sounded urgent. Thomas looked at Voss. It was. Judge Albright dismounted slowly, a lean elderly man with eyes that missed little. I understand there are disputed guardianship papers, debt claims, and allegations of forged land transfer. Voss forced a laugh. Judge, this is a private custody matter exaggerated by frontier gossip. The judge looked toward Jacob and Eli. Children are rarely private property, Mr. Voss. Reverend Miles stepped onto the porch and gently guided Eli back toward Mrs. Bell, who immediately wrapped him tighter. The church women followed, one whispering that she knew 3 children who had passed through Voss' house and come out thinner than when they entered. The air changed. Voss felt it. His authority depended on arriving first, speaking loudest, and making children seem smaller than documents. Now the yard had witnesses with names, memory, and standing. Thomas removed Clara's letters from inside his coat. His wounded arm protested, but he ignored it. Clara Bennett left these. Voss's eyes fixed on the papers. Stolen documents. Judge Albright held out his hand. I'll decide what they are. Thomas handed them over. Jacob made a small sound, but Thomas glanced at him and said softly, We bring it into daylight. The judge read in silence. The yard waited. Wind moved loose snow across the ground. Eli coughed inside the doorway. Voss's horse stamped. After several minutes, Judge Albright looked up, his face grave. Sheriff, place Deputy Marshal Reed under arrest, pending inquiry into unlawful pursuit, assault, and fraudulent custody enforcement. Reed shouted from the mudroom, You can't. Sheriff Bell nodded to 2 men. I can. Voss's face reddened. Judge, those are unverified letters from a dead woman. They are not all letters, Albright said. He held up the folded deed. This appears to be an original Bennett River claim deed with county seal intact. One of the county clerks stepped forward despite Voss's glare. May I see it? The judge handed it over. The clerk examined the seal, then went pale. It is genuine, Voss snapped. Or an excellent forgery. The clerk shook his head slowly. No. The paper stock, seal press, and registry mark are correct for the old county office. The second clerk looked at the Voss documents, then at the Bennett deed. If this is genuine, the later transfer may be invalid. The river ranchers began murmuring. One said, Then our water contracts with Voss are built on fraud. Another cursed aloud. Voss raised his voice. This proves nothing about the boys. Jacob suddenly stepped forward again. His face was white, but his voice carried. My mother said if Thomas still lived, we should give him the key. She said he would know roses don't grow in stolen soil. Judge Albright looked at him gently. And you are Jacob Bennett? The boy hesitated, then lifted his chin. Jacob Thomas Bennett. Thomas closed his eyes for one brief second. Voss looked from Jacob to Thomas and saw what everyone else saw. Not proof yet, not legally, but a bond older than the moment. Desperation flashed across his face. He pulled a pistol from beneath his coat. The yard erupted. But Voss did not aim at Thomas. He aimed at Eli, standing small and fevered in the doorway with the necklace shining at his throat. The rose comes with me, Voss snarled. Jacob moved first. He shoved Eli aside just as the gun fired. The bullet struck the porch post where Eli's head had been. Sheriff Bell fired back, hitting Voss in the shoulder. Voss fell from the saddle into the snow. His riders scattered or raised empty hands as ranch rifles surrounded them. Mrs. Bell screamed. Jacob was on the porch floor, arms around Eli. Thomas reached them before he realized he had moved. Jacob! The boy lifted his head. I'm fine, Eli sobbed against him. Thomas gathered both brothers into his arms, ignoring the pain in his wound, ignoring the men, the guns, the papers, everything except the terrible warmth of 2 children still alive. Jacob stiffened at first. Then, for the first time since entering the ranch, he leaned into Thomas instead of away. In the yard, Clay Voss groaned as Sheriff Bell and Caleb Ross disarmed him. Judge Albright stood over the fallen man, face cold with disgust. Mr. Voss, he said, I believe the custody matter has become criminal. Voss spat blood into the snow and glared at Thomas. This isn't over. Thomas looked up from the boys, Clara's necklace pressed between them. His voice was quiet, but it carried across the yard. No, But now it begins where you cannot hide. By afternoon, Voss and Reed were both locked in the ranch smokehouse under guard, an irony Mrs. Bell appreciated loudly. Judge Albright ordered the boys to remain temporarily under Thomas Whitaker's protection pending full hearing in Cedar Hollow. The Bennett deed, Clara's letters, the false custody papers, and Reed's altered warrant were sealed under witness. Eli was put back to bed. Jacob refused to leave his side until Mrs. Bell promised she would personally bite anyone who tried to move him. As the sun lowered over the snow-bright valley, Thomas stood in the kitchen doorway watching the brothers sleep near the hearth. Judge Albright approached quietly. "You understand, Mr. Whitaker, this will not be simple." Thomas nodded. "Nothing worth saving ever is." The judge looked toward Jacob. "The name may matter. It already does. If he is your son." Thomas interrupted softly. "He is Clara's son. That is enough for tonight." Judge Albright studied him, then nodded with approval. "Hearing at Cedar Hollow in 2 days, weather permitting." Thomas looked at the silver rose necklace glinting against Eli's blanket and Clara's letters sealed inside a wooden case on the table. Outside, the first stars appeared over Whitaker Ranch. For 20 years, Thomas had believed his past was a closed gate. Now 2 boys had carried it back through a blizzard, and behind them came wolves, lawmen, judges, and truth. He did not know what the hearing would decide. He did not know whether Jacob shared his blood. He did not know whether Eli would survive the fever. But he knew this: the barn where they had almost frozen would never again be the place they remembered as the end of hope. If Thomas Whitaker had breath left, it would be remembered as the place their mother's rose finally brought them home.